The October Inside Infinite is here, and this time it focused on the UI and character teams. So today we're going to dive into it a little bit and just go over the things that I thought were the most interesting and most important, as there is a fair amount of fluff in there if I'm being honest, but there is definitely some cool information in there also. So I wanted to highlight the stuff that I thought was cool. However, if you read through the whole thing and you found other things cool that you want to discuss, make sure to comment it below. Anyways, let's get started. So it kind of opens up with 343 saying they want to create compelling AI combatants. When they're designing the game, you always have the choice of what kind of enemies you want in a certain encounter, whether it's a grunt or a brute or a jackal or an elite. And it's really important when you're creating these combat encounters that the choices that you are making lead to a good gameplay experience. But not only does the experience to the player have to feel good, you also want to make sure that these different enemy types are creating unique experiences in combat. You don't want multiple different enemy types that feel the same to fight and just look a little bit different. And so that's something they kind of focused on to make sure that these different enemy types are not only compelling, but also unique experiences to combat. Not only that, in each of the specific enemy types, whether it's a brute, a jackal, an elite, they'll have the variants that we've seen in prior Halo games that support different roles, but also different combat challenges for the player. Another cool thing that they talked about a little bit, and I mean, we've seen this throughout the history of Halo, is that in Halo Infinite, they wanted to embrace the sci-fi nature of Halo, which means basically just allowing them to bring cool, unique alien species that other shooters don't necessarily have the opportunity to have in their game. The next section they talked about was how they wanted the player to have good player comprehension. And in this, they kind of just mean, the hit reaction, sound effects feedback, or what an AI says. It should all contextually make sense to the player and help you understand if what you're doing is effective or whether you need to change tactics. Then they kind of went on to talk a little bit about how Halo now has a 20-year history. So they kind of dove into how they struck a balance between staying true to the legacy character designs while also ensuring that they fit within the visual and design language of Halo Infinite specifically. Here they kind of mentioned that having Halo Infinite be a spiritual reboot actually made it easier for them to incorporate some of the more legacy designs into characters, and we've seen that a ton so far. One of the best examples of this here is the elites, grunts, and jackals, who now have a much more legacy design to them than they did obviously in Halo 4 or 5 if you remember how they looked in those games. They also shared this image here of the elite, and I must say this is probably the best elites have looked in a long time in Halo. Moving on, they talked a little bit about kind of how Halo Infinite is obviously the return of the brutes, and one thing that was important to them when designing the brutes was making sure that they were aggressive as they should be since they are brutes, but at the same time make sure they didn't just feel like dumb enemies. 343 kind of talked about how they felt that the brutes in this game are really good variety to the elites, who are going to tend to be a little bit more composed and tactical. They also talked about how one cool thing with the brutes is that as you fight them, you're going to see all kinds of armor and debris flying off of them, from shoulder pads to thigh pads to helmets, shooting across the map as they take damage. They also gave us this nice render of a brute who again looks pretty damn badass. This is a brute berserker. The little caption below says, "Be warned, they are angry and they will charge," so I imagine if you pop off certain armor or something like that, they probably get enraged and charge at you, which will be pretty fun. Then they talked about our favorite buddy Craig, and they said that while it was fun to see the community kind of embrace Craig, he did unfortunately highlight some systems that were definitely not ready to be shown off. So Craig is in good hands, but he has definitely gone through some changes. I bet most likely we're going to have a nice Craig Easter egg, but they show this nice render of a brute close up to kind of show that Craig did indeed get quite the glow up. And I mean, if you look at this image, he does look pretty damn cool. Important to note though, these are renders as opposed to Craig, who was an asset from in-game, but this does kind of show there is a lot more detail to these brutes than there was back in 2020. Next up, they talked a little bit about how Halo Infinite has this huge evolved sandbox compared to prior games, and how because of this, the combat encounters are just so much more expansive with the different interactions that you can pull off with the sandbox to kind of engage with it and have these different combat encounters in your own way. One thing that they mentioned specifically, obviously, as we've seen, fusion coils can be thrown by the player, but they can also now be thrown at you by brutes, and the brutes can also throw grunts at us like we saw back in the 2020 trailer. They talked a little bit about how the Grapple Shot and how it has different interactions with different enemy types. So if you use it on a brute, it's going to pull you to a brute, but if you try and use it on a hunter, they can deflect it, and at the same time, if you shoot it at a jackal, it's going to pop their shield. Another cool thing that they've kind of improved in Halo Infinite is the AI now is going to upgrade their weapons with better weapons off the battlefield. So if there's a power weapon on the floor or something, they might pick it up and use it against you. They kind of also had to rework a little bit the way that encounters worked, with Halo Infinite being much more open to account for the 360 degrees of combat, to make sure that the player still feels like Master Chief and can wade into combat without feeling overwhelmed. With the bigger, more open combat spaces, they wanted to maintain that Halo feel, which means allowing the player to still be aggressive and remain on the offensive, as opposed to feeling like you're playing a cover shooter. They also share these cool images of Jackals, and I mean, they just look pretty sweet, although, you know, the Jackal on the left, I know he's going to piss me off when I'm playing on Legendary. And then we also got a render of the Grunt Mule, who is basically the banished equivalent of a Postmates weapon delivery service. So they might pop in and bring a power weapon to a brute or something who will pick up their weapon and use it against you, which sounds pretty dang cool. They also talked a little bit more about the Spartan killers, and they gave us this render of Jega Radomni. I can't pronounce these names at all, but look at him. I mean, he's a total badass. And while we don't know if Arbiter's going to be in Halo Infinite, I hope he is because I love the Arbiter. These badass looking things could be a pretty cool replacement. They also expanded a little bit about the Skimmer, which is one of the new enemy types in Halo Infinite. And basically here they kind of said that these Skimmers are a mid-tier opponent, sort of on the same tier as Jackals. But one cool thing they mentioned here is that they aren't actually fully flying enemies like the drones in previous games, but more so just hover above the ground, which definitely sounds a lot more enjoyable to fight than the drones from something like Halo 2 or 3. With that, they also shared the image of the Skimmer looking pretty cool, and they also shared this image of the two little grunts, and I will say I prefer this grunt design a lot more than something like the Halo 4 design. The next section of the Inside Infinite kind of broke down the UI and everything like that, and they talked about how for the HUD, they removed the helmet geometry and shifted persistent elements out of the top corners, which we saw from the flights, so no longer do you have grenade or weapon information in the top left or right corner. They say this is to reduce eye fatigue, cognitive load, and arena sweatiness, which were serious issues called out by Halo 5 players. I will be honest here, I don't remember anyone complaining that they had to look in the top left or right corner for information about grenades or weapons or anything like that, but I'm not a game designer, so maybe there were people complaining about that, and maybe this was a legitimate issue. I do like that they've gotten rid of the helmet geometry. That did show up in something like the Halo 5 campaign. I was never a big fan of that, as I did feel that kind of cluttered up your vision of the game. So no problem with them getting rid of that, but I am still a little bit skeptical about jamming basically all the HUD information into the bottom left and right corner, along with kind of the middle. They basically said one of the main reasons that they did this was that players no longer are going to have to scan all four corners of the screen constantly during gameplay, and this will allow players to no longer feel pressure from the HUD layout, but rather from the gameplay situation itself. They say that by moving these elements to create breathing room, players can also enjoy the skybox and Halo Ring, find vertical targets faster, and have a better experience when using something like the Grapple Shot specifically. Like I said, I'm a little bit skeptical about that, but I will say the UI from the flights at least was pretty clean. They also shared with us a nice image here, kind of just depicting the UI in a battle in the campaign. There's also this nice just environment shot that they shared with us here. And then they got a little bit into the Visor OS, where they showed these pictures where you have kind of the AR screen, along with the screens in the Warthog and all the systems for upgrades, along with sharing another picture of the upgrade screen to upgrade all your different equipment. They also talked about how the Visor OS has 5 main sections in campaign, and you can see that here in this image, where you have the TAC map, which is an expansive map, and mission tracker. You have the upgrades tab, which is where you're going to upgrade all of your equipment and suit upgrades for Master Chief. Your FOB, which is the available support items from forward operating bases. You have the targets, which is a dossier of high value targets to take down. And lastly, there's the database tab, which is a compendium of narrative logs and collectibles found across the world of Zeta Halo. This is definitely a big change in terms of a Halo game, as we've not had anything like this in any of the prior campaigns. So it'll be interesting to jump into this, see how it feels, and kind of get into it firsthand. Lastly, they had a big section all about customization. I mostly just kind of want to point out some of the pictures that they shared here. So there's the scout helmet here that looks pretty cool, and the Mark V armor core that looks pretty cool. along with also showing the sockets for your helmet, I believe, in this image where you can put on different helmet attachments. And then last but not least, they talked about the creation of manufacturer logos and weapon decals. So now you have all these different manufacturers that make the different weapons of Halo, and they shared some images of these and talked about them a little bit. And I'm not going to get into it too deep, but if you want to check it out, you can go check out the post yourself. But they did show these cool breakdowns of the different weapons, where it shows all the different decals that are on these weapons that honestly you might not notice when just playing, but it is really cool to see all of the detail that goes into a weapon like this, just to give it that full package when you're using it. It's not as easy as just slapping some gray on it or something like that. And that's pretty much going to do it for this Inside Infinite, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, you know what to do. Make sure you follow me over on Twitch. I stream Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. You can also follow me over on Twitter or Instagram. And with that said, I'll see you all next time.